Did you know that mother-in-law and daughter-in-law conflict dates back as far as the Roman times? You're going to want to hear from Dr. Joanne Scott as she shares her insights and some tips about this important relationship. My name is Emily Sellis, and I am the host for Sage Holistic Show.
Sage is a 501c3 nonprofit organization building community by providing education and counseling about physical, mental, and spiritual well-being. We encourage all of our listeners to find their own path to what holistic wellness means to you.
Hi, I am Dr. Joanne Scott, and I'm talking today about in-law relationship conflict. Just a little bit about myself. I'm originally from the UK, and I've been a therapist for 15 years. I originally did my MA in the UK and moved over to the US. So I had years of working as a therapist over there before I came over here. My qualifications in the UK didn't transfer, so I ended up taking on my doctorate so that I could work over here, and then went on to become a licensed psychologist. I got interested in working, well, to kind of backtrack a little bit. After I'd been here for a year, I gave birth to my first son, and it was around that time that I started having some challenges in my relationship with my mother-in-law. And I was also spending time with other new mums at that time, and came to kind of recognize that I wasn't alone. A lot of people had similar challenges in their relationships with their mother-in-laws, and it was very curious to me because these were women who, you know, I as much as I could assess, were very, you know, just amazing women, very loving, you know. And when I met their mother-in-laws, I also kind of had the same experience, like, this is a great woman, where's this problem coming from? So it was, you know, I was thinking about it for a long time. Then after I had my second son, I started my doctorate program and eventually decided to write my dissertation on in-law relationships. So my actual dissertation itself is on the relationship between a mother-in-law and a daughter-in-law following the birth of the first grandchild. And that's where the majority of my knowledge comes from. And so as I kind of go through this presentation, you know, the idea of in-laws is so vast, and I just could not cover every nuance of an in-law relationship, because there's the father-in-law, there's the mother-in-law, there's the son-in-law, there's a daughter-in-law, then there's sister-in-laws and brother-in-laws, and there's so many different combinations of in-law relationships that I do recognize that a hole in my knowledge is really, I don't know what the relationship between, I don't know so much about the perspective of the mother-in-law towards the daughter-in-law. That's there's actually very little information about any of, there's little research on the field of in-law relationships altogether. And the majority of it is about the relationship between the daughter-in-law and the mother-in-law. So that's what I kind of, you know, this is kind of centered around, although I'm hoping that some of it will at least translate to other nuances of the in-law relationship. The other thing to say, you know, there's so little research and writing in the area as it is, that this is a very heteronormative presentation. I don't know anything about the LGBTQ community and how in-law relationships are impacted in that particular arena. And so I just kind of wanted to throw that out there. If anyone has information, or I am absolutely passionate about in-law relationships. So if anyone has information, if anyone knows anything, you know, please hit me up with it, because I could talk about this forever, you know, and I hope that I'm going to be able to keep it to 20 minutes. So, how do I move the thing along? I got it. Okay, so again, you know, we will talk a little bit about culture in a few slides time, but in Western culture, it's typically the situation that the decision to marry is usually voluntary, but becoming an in-law is usually an acquired position. It's not typical for the majority of people to think, oh, I'd really like to be a daughter-in-law, I'd really like to be a son-in-law. have to go and find a wife or a husband for that. That's not usually how it goes. So research has suggested that women tend to idealize the idea of marriage and have ambivalent feelings about entering into an in-law relationship. This, if you've seen it, it's a movie called The Monster-in-Law, and it kind of talks a lot about in-law conflict in this. This is kind of like a great depiction of what can happen. This is fascinating to me. Mother-in-law jokes have dated back to Roman times. And although it's typically men and male comedians that tell mother-in-law jokes, the main source of conflict and problems is usually between a mother-in-law and a daughter-in-law. So, I mean, I could have gone on for days looking for in-law jokes and memes on the internet. And daughter-in-laws are usually depicted on the media as having negative feelings towards their mother-in-laws. So I hope that I get this name right, although, I've been trying to pronounce it for the last 8 years and I'm not sure that I do it right. Excuse me, I'm just going to take a drink before I try. Researcher Morsewicz has suggested that it's the combination of in-law relationships being both non-voluntary and triadic that create the conflict. And so we are accustomed to non-voluntary relationships in our lives. We run into co-workers, our neighbours. We don't necessarily choose these relationships. And we also, are familiar with the idea of having a triadic relationship. We can go out and meet a friend and they can bring another friend along. But the combination of the two things is what the researchers think creates challenges, that you're forced into a triadic relationship. And this can kind of show up, and I will talk a little bit about triangles later, but again, it's just fascinating to me. One member of the triangle, one member of the triad can definitely be very influential in the way that other members of the triad experience the relationship. So, a savvy son-in-law is going to be telling his wife all the good things that his mother said about her and leaving out all the bad. But obviously the flip side is also true. So a member of the triad can definitely be corruptive in the relationship and the breakdown of it. This is a photo of my sister, and this is a photo of her, and I hope I get this right. She's in Zimbabwe and she's entering her husband's family's home for the first time. And they are doing a ritual. It's part of a video, and they're singing and they're laying out a carpet for her. So every time she kind of walked a little bit further, they picked the carpet up and they put it in front of her. Then she took a little bit more of a walk. She has an amazing relationship with her in-laws. But culture, if you're working with couples and they have in-law issues, it's so important to talk to them about the culture and the cultural expectations. It's not necessarily a given that a different culture is going to become a challenge. In fact, different cultures can sometimes create an easier relationship because the expectations are not there in the first place. The in-law that's entering into the culture that's different hopefully will come with enough of an open mind to kind of embrace a new culture. But it can become problematic if expectations are different and cultural practices are different. Certainly in a lot of Asian cultures, it's the practice that the daughter-in-law will move into the family home. In traditional China, there is a practice called I hope I pronounce this right, the Peiru, which is known as doing the month. And in that practice, in the month following childbirth, the mother-in-law moves in and is responsible for doing all of the chores aside from childcare, to the point that the new mother can't even open the fridge door. And I've spoke to, when I did my research, I spoke to how that kind of shows up, what that looks like in modern day culture and in Orange County. And I spoke to one very appreciative lady who said that her mother-in-law actually, because she was in China and couldn't be in the family home to do that, paid for a nanny to be in the home for a month. And there's also places, I believe, in China that where new mums just go to be taken care of for a month, which the in-laws would kind of pay for. So I know that the idea of having your mother-in-law move in and take care of you for a month might be a little bit scary for some of us, but actually it sounds like, you know, it's kind of a practice that could be really nice if it's done in a way that it can be helpful. It's really interesting that in terms of research, typically when there's a lot of research on cultural variations in in-law relationships, and there's certainly something called mother-in-law abuse, which kind of it's helpful to be aware of. Oftentimes in some Asian cultures, the time that the mother-in-law becomes a mother-in-law is the first time that she's had any power in the family home. And sometimes it's one of the biggest sources of abuse in some countries is mother-in-law abuse, abuse of the daughter-in-law. So, you know, it's important to be aware of that. But in terms of the research, most of the research on Western culture looks at dynamics in the relationship, whereas in Asian cultures, it tends to focus on cultural aspects and the way that the community and the culture expectations show up. So if you are working with couples or individuals, some questions that you might want to ask are how familiar are they with their in-laws culture? How willing are they to explore and engage in cultural practices that differ from their own? And what expectations do they have for their partner's engagement in cultural practices? Because those are all things that are certainly going to influence the way that the relationship plays out. So we have the holidays coming up, and most therapists are aware that that can be a very challenging time for all family dynamics, not just in-law dynamics. But if you have a couple, you know, it's helpful to have them have these conversations ahead of time about what their expectations are for the holidays. One of the things that you can think about doing if there's conflict is to encourage them to create their own traditions where they put boundaries in place to their levels of comfort about how in-laws are introduced or not introduced. It's, I said so much about this that fascinates me, but communication in the family and how an in-law family relates to the presence of an outsider is really pivotal in how that relationship, you know, the success of the relationship. So when in-law families are willing to be flexible in their communication, flexible in the amount of time they anticipate seeing in-laws, when they don't engage in jokes, and when they don't spend the whole of their time referencing past memories that don't involve the in-law, those are all things that can help in terms of creating, you know, a sense of belonging and integration to the new in-law. So in terms of supporting our clients, it can be very tempting to get pulled into horror stories about mother-in-laws or content about what the mother-in-law did next. But in terms of helping, you know, the relationships, most people that work with couples will kind of know that if a couple is strong, then it will be a mitigating factor against external areas of potential stress. And so working on how the couple are turning together and talking about these things, you know, is really helpful. The Gottmans talk about this a little bit in their book, The 7 Principles of Making Marriage Work, and their position's very clear. They say that it's the absolute role of the adult child to put boundaries in place with their parents. However, in The Dance of Anger, Harriet Lerner also addresses it, and she says it's absolutely the role of the individual with the problem to put the boundaries in place. And how you're going to address it is certainly going to depend on what's showing up in your office. If it's an individual, if it's a couple, what their particular dynamics are. I don't think there's no recipe for working with in-law conflict. You know, I couldn't think of one when I started thinking about how I wanted to talk about this. But certainly, if you're working with an individual, it can be very helpful to explore their experience of putting boundaries in place with anyone in their life, how they feel about protecting their own boundaries, asserting themselves, their concerns that they have around that. This is, I could so go down a rabbit hole on this one because this is so fascinating to me, but I'm going to try and keep it really concise. Assess for projection. It's so fascinating to me. Our psyches have a really hard time with holding the shadow of motherhood. And so you might notice that in all fairy tales, the bad mother is always the stepmother. And that's because the maternal mother is just too hard to hold with the negative, hold a negative connotation against. Actually, the Grimm's brothers, they did write a fairy tale, and it's called the Mother-in-Law, that never actually made it into the collective works because it was so graphically awful, and depicted the mother-in-law being an ogre who consumed her daughter-in-law and grandchildren. All this to say that because that we have a hard time holding the negative images of the maternal mother, there's a lot of projection that happens culturally and individually to mother-in-laws, to be honest. And this certainly showed up in my research with new mothers, because we all know, and the research says that, you know, marital satisfaction usually declines in the first year following childbirth, and this kind of leads into the triangulation. So oftentimes, in order to take conflict outside of the marital relationship, a couple and the mother-in-law will unconsciously agree to allow the mother-in-law to be the bad guy, basically, in exactly the same way as, you know, if you see the identified patient in a school acting out to bring his parents together to, if his parents are kind of divorcing and he acts out in school and the parents come together to support the child, it's the same kind of a situation, all very unconscious, but to take the idea of the dissatisfaction outside of the relationship and project it onto another figure, the mother-in-law is often a good person for that to happen to. Yeah, this is the last point about, this is a personal plea, this is nothing in the research. I have a really hard time in psychology how we've started creating these really demeaning labels for people. And I've seen this term toxic in-law pop up. People aren't toxic. For no doubt there are people in the world who you know, have been so damaged by the world that it's very hard for them to have healthy relationships. But please don't use terms like toxic in-law with your clients. You know, please don't use those terms in general, like, you know, it's a toxic mother. It's people are people, and sometimes they're very challenged in having relationships, but it doesn't help, I don't think, to put the problem out there like this is the toxic person and we're going to avoid the toxic person. Even, you know, terms like emotional immaturity, I just think they're kind of degrading and they're putting down, and they don't really describe what's happening. So that's just a personal rant that I thought I'd use this platform to.
Well, and I just want to jump in too, Joe, because we're at our 20 minutes. So what I want to do is I want to encourage everyone too who's listening and kind of jotting some things down is we have time for Q&A. So I want people to jump in, unmute yourselves, because I think I went through and muted everyone. So if you guys have questions as, you know, Joanne's talking, or, you know, something she said, you know, kind of sparked a thought or a memory, please jump in. And if there isn't anything, you know, Joe, like I said, please continue. We have Coach Joe starting right at 10:15, so just kind of keeping an eye on the clock.
Yes.
But
that's fine. This is my last slide anyway. This is me and my mother-in-law at one of those Pinot palette events. I will say, you know, obviously I did this research and I took this journey because I was very confused about my challenges with my mother-in-law, and it's been the most rewarding relationship that I've had in my life. It's definitely been the most challenging, and you know, we have a really good relationship now. And I think, you know, the conclusion I came to at the, you know, as I've kind of got to this stage is, I never thought I'd have to work on a relationship. You know, I didn't think it was going to be work, and it is work. Some relationships you have to work at, and so this is us. This is the last time she visited last year. We have a really good relationship now, and it was like for no other reason, like my doctoral research. If no one ever reads it, you know, I feel like it was a worthwhile endeavor.
that's wonderful. Thank you. All right, you guys. So take all that in. That's a lot of really good information. Go ahead and unmute yourselves. And again, we have Joe here with us. So this is the time if you've got some specific questions, whether it's personal, whether it's with who you're working with, now is the time to do that for sure.
I have a question. Well, I can say I did like what you said, and I definitely struggle with some of these things as well. I guess my question is, well, I can say when you were mentioning how sometimes the cultural difference can be a good thing, I have noticed that. Because my husband, his mother doesn't really speak English, but that's also been a benefit to me because they don't rant at me as much.
Yeah,
that's from their culture. They wouldn't be pushing those things on me as much. But I'm curious if your experiences with families like where the in-laws do speak a different language. So there's like almost like that, like you're saying, that barrier is like how close can you be with those people? And I'm just curious how you've seen people manage that in a good way where they're still feeling like they're connected.
So, you know, I'll be transparent. I haven't seen that particular issue in my practice. I have seen it with my brother, actually. His in-laws are from Tajikistan, and they speak Russian. And the way that I've seen it, you know, certainly I think it's been a successful relationship in the same way as you've described for my brother. But he certainly like made some attempts to speak Russian to them as well. Like he's learnt words, and he doesn't get lazy or, you know, he definitely attempts to meet them, you know, where they're at as well. I don't know if that answers the question. You know, I'd be interested for other people's perspectives, but I haven't actually seen that.
Yeah, it was just funny because of course they speak one of the one like Asian language I've never learned. The one that's like so remote that's hard too, where it's like you're really only learning it for that reason. But yeah, I could see that could be helpful.
Yeah, I think that's fascinating, kind of piggybacking off of your question, Jody, as well. I have my in-laws are able to speak pretty good English, but it's not their first language. And I think as far as that culture piece goes, they're not necessarily as traditional as some other Filipinos that I've known. And so I can see how these dynamics can make such a big difference in the marriage, right? For like my partner and I, like I could see how that would be more challenging if they did hold more traditional roles. But I have found in my experience, just taking an interest in their foods or in their culture, you know, I've visited the Philippines, and just opening up to that has I think done a lot for my relationship with my in-laws. You know, just showing an interest, even though I don't speak Tagalog, I'm able to at least show that interest and that has helped. But then it's also like, again, that's really an important point you made, Joanne, about being aware of those cultural differences and talking about those and talking about expectations. I think that's so incredible, all the insights that you've pulled together for us.
Thank you. And certainly some of the challenges can come when the cultures are very similar, and your expectation is, say Christmas is going to look one way and theirs is just slightly off. That can be even more challenging than, oh, we don't celebrate Christmas. That can be a bigger challenge sometimes, I think.
I found it interesting, the point that you were making about the distinction between Gottman approach to setting boundaries, and I can't remember who the other person was. But I feel like, how do you, I feel like that rings so close to home in terms of like trying to understand like who should be setting, like doing the hard work of setting these boundaries. That comes down to like the couple and trying to like duke it out and figure out who's responsible for this piece and things like that.
Yeah, and I think again, culture plays a huge role, because if it's going to be more if there's damage that can be done by potentially, the daughter-in-law speaking, and that's not anticipated in the culture, and it feels like it can't be absorbed, then it can be damaging to kind of go for that route, I think, if that's not culturally appropriate. And I'm not like a hardened, in the 70s, like we became very big about just saying it as we feel it. And, I think if you can get the same result and you can go a softer route and everyone's happier at the end, like, why would you want to like create something that's like so potentially volatile? If you can just, if you can have a word in your husband's or your wife's ear and say, this is how I'm feeling, and they can integrate, intervene, I think that's fine.
I have a question, Joe.
Hi.
Hey, you. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that nurturing role that moms have, or that maternal innate instinct, if it's a healthy relationship, like Asterix, healthy relationship with the kid, that when that role is threatened potentially by a new person coming in to love their son, and that umbilical cord, like some people it's like, well, she just need to cut that umbilical cord, where indeed it's like, it's not about taking over, but there is an additional person to love the kid, the mom's kid, right? So if you can talk a little bit about that, where we can still continue to nurture our kids even if they grow up, and it's not necessarily a threat. If you can talk about that.
So I think if I've understood what you're asking correctly, are you talking about, a healthy mother that has that strong bond but wants to let their son or daughter go and be in this relationship? Are you kind of talking to that, or like this like unhealthy dynamic and just cut the damn cord?
Well, it's more so like, how some people could perceive it as a threat when the daughter-in-law comes in, or that the mother could be feeling threatened in her role as that nurturer, but all of a sudden there's a second person there to love the kid. And if you can talk about that dynamic of how to go about that, or when there's really potentially not really a threat, but it's their own insecurities or whatever else that paints.
So I don't know if you're familiar with someone called Jean. I never pronounce her name properly because I've just got horrible. Jean Bolan, anyway. There's a Simone Bolan. She wrote a couple of really good books on archetypes in women, and I think it can be helpful in informing what some women carry what's known as like a Demeter archetype, and their whole thing in life is just to be mothers. They just love the mothering role. They embody it. It's their joy. And if that gets kind of a little bit out of whack, and they only identify with that archetype, then they can find it very challenging when another person comes in and now they're not, their kind of role is threatened. And so in terms of, if I was working with a mother that was expressing this to me, if they were saying, oh, I've only ever wanted to be a mother, I've loved him and now he's kind of gone, if that was what was coming up, I would be definitely pointing it to these books, but also look at all the other archetypal energies that maybe you haven't been, all the other parts of yourself that you haven't been growing into while you've been focusing on this mother role, because there's something that's kind of a little bit off balance here. And maybe this is your time to embody, a different archetype. Maybe it's like your time to be an Artemis and to kind of go out and be a crusader for children and, a mother to all. So how can you use that energy in a way that's not going to corrupt this new relationship? There's like a couple of books that I have here when he's married to his mum and Silently Seduced. And they are, they kind of speak to the shadow parts of this a little bit more, really. And certainly like Silently Seduced is a book about covert incest. So incest when there's no sexual, there's not the sexual molestation that's happened, but the emotional experience is the same. So some parents, they just have a very hard time with knowing where the boundaries are with their children, and they kind of use their children as self objects, and that's something to definitely be worked through.
Thank you for spending some of your time today with us at Sage Holistic Health and Wellness Center. If you like what we're all about, please consider supporting our nonprofit organization by making a tax-deductible donation. To do this, you can go to our website at www.sagewellnessctr.org and click on Donate in the upper right-hand corner. We look forward to spending some time again with you real soon. Take good care.